The glare off the Santa Barbara limestone was blinding at 2 in the afternoon, baking the construction dust into a fine, choking powder that coated the back of David's throat. He dragged the collar of his gray t-shirt across his forehead, feeling the grit scrape his skin, and stared at the topographical blueprints snapping in the coastal wind against the hood of his truck. The load-bearing calculations for the charity gala's main pavilion were wrong. The soil grading was too steep by 3 degrees, and the temporary footings were already settling into the sandy loam. He was calculating the necessary torque to drive the helical piers deeper into the bedrock when a small voice interrupted from the passenger side of his truck. "Can I come help now, Daddy?" Emily Robinson sat with her legs dangling from the open door, a purple crayon clutched in one hand and a half-finished drawing balanced on her knees. 6 years old, with gap-toothed smile and braids tied with ribbons, the exact shade of lavender her mother had loved. The portable oxygen monitor clipped to her belt showed steady green numbers, heart rate normal, saturation 97%. 3 years since the surgery that repaired the ventricular septal defect in her tiny chest. 3 years since Jennifer's funeral on a cold March morning when the grief felt like drowning. "Not yet, baby girl. Give me 5 more minutes to check these numbers." David turned back to the blueprints, his pencil marking the problem zones with quick, efficient strokes. The main pavilion was designed to hold 300 guests, most of them children in wheelchairs or using mobility aids. If the foundation failed under that weight, if the structure shifted even 6 inches during the event, the consequences would be catastrophic. He had built retaining walls in earthquake zones and designed drainage systems for coastal erosion projects. He understood load distribution and soil mechanics the way other men understood sports statistics or stock portfolios. This foundation was a disaster waiting to happen. A flash of vivid primary colors caught his peripheral vision. David stopped, the heavy steel soil probe dangling from his grip. The estate's stone courtyard, usually a blur of panicked vendors and forklift exhaust, suddenly went very quiet. Michelle Hayes stood under the canopy of the century-old olive trees he had spent 3 weeks rehabilitating. She was not wearing the sharp-tailored blazers she usually utilized as armor when negotiating with hostile contractors. Instead, she wore a red and blue superhero suit built for the children's interactive zone, made from durable performance fabric that could handle climbing walls and hours in the sun. A stark white spider emblem stretched across the front, and the material caught the harsh California sunlight like a declaration of war against gravity and good taste. Emily's crayon clattered to the truck floor. "Daddy, a real superhero!" The little girl scrambled down from the passenger seat, her purple dress fluttering as she ran across the dusty pavement toward Michelle. David's heart kicked against his ribs, the instinct to protect always faster than logic. But Emily stopped a respectful 3 feet away, tilting her head to study the woman in the improbable costume. Michelle Hayes looked completely out of place against the rustic masonry, yet she commanded the space entirely. Her hands were planted firmly on her hips, posture defensive but anchored. She watched Emily's approach with something that looked like panic poorly disguised as professionalism. I'm just testing the costume for the interactive zone." Emily's smile widened, revealing the gap where her front tooth had fallen out last week. "You look like you could save people. Can you fly?" "No. Just climbing walls and supervised activities." Michelle's voice had the clipped precision of someone who dealt with problems through spreadsheets and scheduled meetings, not through impromptu conversations with enthusiastic 6-year-olds. David crossed the courtyard, gravel crunching under his work boots, and placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Emily, give the lady some space. She's working." "But Daddy, she's wearing a superhero suit. That means she helps people, right?" Michelle's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering behind her eyes before the professional mask slammed back into place. She looked directly at David for the first time since arriving on site 2 weeks ago, and he saw exhaustion there, the kind that came from carrying weight no spreadsheet could calculate. It's highly visible. The kids won't lose you in the crowd. David kept his voice neutral, offering the observation as a practical assessment rather than commentary on the surreal image of a 37-year-old CEO dressed like a comic book character. Michelle's shoulders dropped by half an inch. It was small, but he saw it. A plan was always lighter to carry than fear. Emily tugged on David's sleeve, her purple crayon now tucked behind her ear. Miss Michelle has sad eyes. Like you when you miss Mommy. The air in the courtyard seemed to thin out. David felt heat crawl up the back of his neck, the shame of a private grief being named so plainly by a child who had not yet learned that some truths were meant to stay hidden. Michelle froze, her hands dropping from her hips, fingers curling into fists at her sides. Emily apologized, that's not polite. But I didn't say anything mean. I said she's sad, not bad, there's a difference. The logic was sound. The delivery was devastating. Michelle blinked rapidly, looking anywhere but at the small girl in the purple dress who had just excavated something she had spent 15 years burying. David cleared his throat, redirecting before the moment could fracture further. What do you need, Michelle? She pulled a leather portfolio from under her arm, flipping it open with movements that were too precise, too controlled. The gesture of someone desperate to return to familiar territory where problems had solutions and emotions stayed filed in their proper compartments. Gary Torres is using his costume vendor as an excuse. He took the deposit, handed us this single prototype, and now he's withholding the staging equipment even though I have the signed escrow release from Tuesday. She stepped closer, the shadow of the olive tree falling across her face. David could see the strain around her eyes, the way her jaw tightened when she mentioned the contractor's name. Gary Torres had been cutting corners since day one, a man who preferred shouting to measuring and believed volume could substitute for competence. He wants a higher base rate before he releases anything else. Show me the escrow release. Michelle did not bristle at the question. That alone told him how serious the situation was. She handed over a clipped stack of papers. The top sheet was the signed escrow authorization dated Tuesday, stamped at 9:14 a.m. Under it sat Gary's revised invoice with a handwritten surcharge jammed into the staging line item. And beneath that, a courier receipt showing the prototype had been delivered while the rest of the order never left the warehouse. David set the soil probe against his truck, flipped through the pages and took 2 quick photos with his phone. The paper trail was clear. Gary had tried to move the dispute out of email, which meant he knew the documentation would hurt him in any formal challenge. I also have the warehouse text thread. Michelle unlocked her phone, pulled up the messages and held the screen where David could read it. Gary's dispatcher had confirmed the inventory on Monday, then gone silent the minute the revised rate sheet appeared. Classic pressure tactic: create urgency, manufacture scarcity, force the client to accept unfavorable terms or watch their project collapse. Keep the signed release, the revised invoice, the courier receipt, and the text thread in one folder. If he tries to say this was a misunderstanding, you put the dates on the table in order and let him drown in his own paperwork. Michelle's shoulders settled by another half-inch. David had learned over 12 years in construction that most people did not need elaborate solutions. They needed someone to confirm their instincts were correct and give them permission to act on what they already knew was true. Emily had wandered back to the truck, retrieving her fallen crayon and adding details to her drawing. David could see the rough outline of stick figures, one tall with tools, one in a cape, one small with purple ribbons. Gary's primary staging contractor. He's been cutting corners since day one. David looked past Michelle's shoulder to the main lawn where Gary's crew was supposed to be laying the interlocking composite deck for the main tent. The ground was bare, earth exposed and vulnerable to the coastal moisture creeping in each night. If the main deck was not built by tomorrow, David's team could not install the perimeter fencing or the heavy botanical installations. The entire charity event designed to fund pediatric mobility equipment would collapse like the soil under his feet. I have 48 hours to find a replacement vendor or convince Gary to honor the paper he signed. Michelle rubbed her temple with 2 fingers, a nervous habit David had noticed the first day they mapped the site. She dropped her hand quickly, squaring her shoulders in the way people did when they refused to let exhaustion win. I just needed to make sure this suit actually allowed for movement before I ordered a cheap knockoff version online. She gestured to David's blueprint still snapping against the truck hood. You look like you're about to tear a hole in that schematic. Tell me my day isn't getting worse, David. The ground under the main pavilion is too soft. Gary's crew didn't compact the subbase. If we put a 10-ton tent on this, the south corner will sink 6 inches the second it rains. It's a structural hazard. Michelle stared at the blueprints, though David knew the engineering marks were a foreign language to her. He watched her jaw tighten, the sheer weight of responsibility pressing down on someone who had already been carrying too much for too long. She was 37, 6 years older than him, and possessed a relentless driving competence that usually cleared rooms. Right now, she just looked incredibly tired. I'll call the foundation. I'll tell Karen we have to delay the build. It'll cost us the venue deposit, but I can't risk the safety inspection. No. The word left his mouth before he processed the decision. David rolled up the blueprint and shoved it into the PVC tube in the bed of his truck. The metal clattered against the other tools scattered there, the sound sharp in the quiet courtyard. You fight Gary on the paperwork. Secure the costumes. I'll fix the ground. Michelle looked at him, the white eyes of the spider emblem stretching as she breathed in. David, you're the landscape architect. You design the flora and the hardscape. You aren't contracted for foundation repair. That's heavy machinery. That's outside your scope. My scope is making sure this site doesn't fail. He pulled his heavy leather work gloves from his back pocket, the worn material soft from years of use. Jennifer had given him these gloves on their first anniversary, back when he was still working 60-hour weeks trying to prove himself in a field that questioned his credentials at every turn. The leather had outlasted her by 3 years. I have a crew of 6, a skid steer loader and 3 pallets of crushed granite that were supposed to be for the decorative pathways. We can repurpose the granite to stabilize the subbase. We pack it, wet it, and roll it. It'll hold the pavilion. He did not mention that it would mean his crew working a double shift through the night or that he would be eating the cost of the granite. It was a logistics nightmare, but it was a clean plan. Michelle's pride instantly reared up, her spine straightening as she set her terms clearly. I can't authorize the overtime budget for that. I'll pay for the granite out of my own emergency fund, and I'll pay your crew's overtime rate directly, but I am not letting you take the financial hit for Gary's negligence. David met her eyes. The fierce independence there was a solid wall, and he respected it too much to argue. She was offering partnership, not charity. There was a difference, and Emily had been right about that particular distinction. Deal. You handle the suits and the paperwork. I'll get the ground ready. Michelle nodded once, sharp and decisive. She turned to leave, the absurd costume somehow transformed into armor through sheer force of will. But she stopped after 3 steps, glancing back at where Emily sat in the truck, humming softly as she drew. She's sweet. She's my reason for everything. Michelle's expression did something complicated, layers of emotion moving beneath the surface too quickly for David to name. Then she was walking back toward the stone courtyard entrance, spine straight, ready to go to war with a contractor who had underestimated her capacity for documentation. For the next 10 hours, the estate became a battlefield of noise and diesel fumes. David climbed into the cab of the skid steer, the familiar vibration of the engine grounding him in the physical reality of moving earth and solving problems one bucket load at a time. They tore out the loose, improperly graded soil Gary had left behind, the bucket of the machine biting into ground that should have been compacted to 95% density weeks ago. The sun dropped behind the Pacific, turning the sky a bruised purple that reminded him of Emily's favorite color, the shade Jennifer had chosen for the nursery before they knew if they were having a boy or a girl. The heavy coastal fog began to roll in, dropping the temperature by 15 degrees and coating everything in a fine mist that made the work lights haloed and strange. David communicated with his crew through hand signals over the roar of the engines. They laid down the geotextile fabric, dumping the crushed granite in precise rows, running the heavy drum roller over the surface until it was as hard as concrete. His crew chief, a man named Marcus who had worked with David since the San Francisco earthquake retrofit projects, operated the roller with the kind of focused intensity that came from understanding the stakes. "Kid's gonna be on this ground come Friday. We do it right or we don't do it at all." Marcus had 3 grandchildren, 2 of them with cerebral palsy. He understood what this event meant beyond the paycheck. Emily had fallen asleep in the truck cab sometime around 9, curled up on the bench seat with David's jacket as a blanket. He checked on her every hour, confirming the oxygen monitor still showed green, her breathing steady and peaceful. She had drawn a new picture before sleep claimed her, this one showing 3 figures, a tall man with a hard hat, a woman in a cape, and a small girl holding both their hands. The purple crayon had been used liberally. It was near midnight when David finally killed the engine of the roller. The silence that rushed back into the courtyard was ringing and profound, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the cliffs and the occasional call of a night bird. The new foundation pad was perfectly level, a gray expanse of packed stone that would easily support the pavilion and the 300 guests who would stand on it in less than 48 hours. David climbed down, his muscles aching with the deep, dull burn of sustained labor. His crew had already begun packing tools, moving with the efficient quiet of exhausted men who took pride in work done properly. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. "Good work, boss. Your wife would be proud." Jennifer. Always Jennifer. Even 3 years gone, she remained the measure against which David tested his choices. She had been a nurse in the pediatric oncology ward, the kind of person who stayed late to read stories to frightened children and advocated fiercely for her patients even when hospital administrators pushed back. She had believed in building things that lasted, in showing up when it mattered, in choosing integrity over convenience. "Promise me you'll build things that last. Don't just survive, David. Live." Her voice in the hospital room, morphine soft but absolutely clear. The cancer had already spread to her lungs by the time they caught it, already metastasized beyond what surgery could reach. She had 3 months from diagnosis to death, and she spent most of that time making David promise he would not let grief consume him, would not let fear keep him from building the kind of life she would want for their daughter. He had kept half that promise. Emily was loved, protected, given every opportunity to thrive despite the heart condition that required careful monitoring. But living? David was still working on that part. Survival had become his default setting, and breaking that pattern required more courage than he had managed to find. The makeshift command center sat under the patio heaters near the main house, a folding table covered with highlighters, contracts, and an open laptop. Michelle was still there. She had changed out of the costume hours ago, now wearing a heavy wool sweater and jeans, her hair pulled into a messy knot. Reading glasses were pushed up on her head, and she was typing something with the focused intensity of someone drafting a strongly worded email to a lawyer. David walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel pathway. He did not say anything, just reached into the insulated cooler he had dragged from his truck earlier and pulled out a thermos. He poured a measure into the metal cap and set it quietly on the table near her elbow. Michelle jumped slightly, looking up. "What's this?" "Peppermint tea. You mentioned yesterday that coffee after 4 p.m. makes your heart race." She stared at the steaming cup, her shoulders easing by a fraction. It was a tiny detail, the kind of thing most people would forget in the chaos of a crisis. But David had learned from watching Jennifer that paying attention to small needs often mattered more than grand gestures. Michelle picked up the cup, letting the warmth bleed into her hands, and took a slow sip. "Thank you." She exhaled a long, shaky breath that seemed to carry the day's stress with it, releasing tension she had been holding in her chest and shoulders for hours. David leaned his hip against the stone pillar, keeping a respectful distance, waiting. "I got Gary on the phone. I cited the specific breach of contract clauses, recorded the call with his consent, and told him I'd have the foundation's legal team file a lien against his business license by 9 a.m. He folded. "The staging equipment and the costumes are arriving tomorrow at noon." "Good." His voice was quiet in the dark courtyard. He looked at the circles under her eyes, the sheer exhaustion she was trying to power through. He recognized that exhaustion. It was the same kind he saw in the mirror every morning, the weight of never being allowed to drop the ball because too many people were counting on you. "You should go home, Michelle. The ground is stable. We can build tomorrow." "I can't." She looked down at the laptop screen, her fingers still resting on the keyboard. The foundation director called. "Karen is moving the timeline. A major donor is flying in a day early. The gala isn't Saturday night anymore. It's Friday. Tomorrow." The air in the courtyard seemed to thin out, David's lungs suddenly struggling to process oxygen. Tomorrow. They had lost 24 hours of build time. It was an impossible deadline, the kind of challenge that would break most project managers and send insurance companies scrambling for liability coverage. "We lose the funding if the pavilion isn't fully operational for the walkthrough at 5 p.m. tomorrow." Michelle rubbed her face with both hands, the gesture destroying whatever professional composure she had been maintaining. "I've spent 8 months putting this together. I thought if I controlled every variable, if I checked every spreadsheet, if I planned for every possible contingency, but I can't control the ground, and I can't control a shady contractor." She looked at him, a sudden stark vulnerability in her eyes that reminded him of Emily's observation. "Sad eyes. Like you when you miss Mommy." "I'm terrified I'm going to fail these kids, David." He did not offer her empty platitudes. He did not tell her it would magically be okay or that everything happened for a reason or any of the other meaningless phrases people deployed when they could not fix a problem. Instead, he took a step closer, stopping exactly 2 feet away from her chair. He kept his hands at his sides, fists clenched lightly to stop the instinct to reach out and pull her into the warmth of his jacket. He offered her the only thing that mattered right now, practical certainty. "We have 17 hours. My crew is coming back at 6 a.m. Gary's trucks arrive at noon. That gives us 5 hours to erect the steel frame, run the lighting trusses, and secure the canopy. It's tight, but it's mathematically possible. I'll oversee the structural rigging myself." David grabbed a carpenter's pencil and the back of a delivery manifest, then broke the problem into pieces. Frame erection, lighting truss order, ADA ramp clearance, generator load. He circled the critical path and handed the page to her. "If Karen asks what changed, tell her this. We cut decorative work before safety. Pavilion first, wheelchair route second, everything else after." Michelle read the list, her breathing steadying as the chaos resolved into actionable steps. "You did that in 30 seconds. I've rebuilt retaining walls with less time than this." David folded the manifest and slid it next to her laptop. "Get 2 hours of sleep. When you come back, bring printed copies of every addendum and payment receipt. If Gary grandstands in front of the board, I want paper in your hand before he opens his mouth." That finally did it. Some of the strain left her face because the plan had teeth now, not just hope. She looked up at him, the strain in her eyes slowly easing as she matched the calm he was forcing into his own posture. You don't have to take on the rigging. You're the landscape architect. I'm the guy making sure this site doesn't fail. He repeated the words he had used earlier, making them a promise rather than a statement. Michelle did not argue. She packed her laptop, her movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. When she walked past him toward her car, she stopped for a fraction of a second, her shoulder brushing his arm. It was not a lingering touch, but the steadiness in it was absolute. The tremor in her hands had stopped. David watched her taillights disappear down the estate's long driveway before returning to his truck. Emily was still asleep in the cab, her breathing steady and peaceful. He carefully lifted her, settling her weight against his shoulder as he carried her to the small construction trailer where he had set up a makeshift bed for nights when the work ran late. She stirred slightly as he laid her down, purple crayon still clutched in one small fist. "Daddy?" "I'm here, baby girl. Go back to sleep." "Did you save the day?" "Not yet, but I'm working on it." Her eyes drifted closed again, trust absolute and unquestioning. David pulled the blanket up to her chin and sat in the folding chair beside the cot, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the oxygen monitor glowing steady green in the darkness. Jennifer's voice in his memory clear as the night she died. "Promise me you'll build things that last." He looked at Emily, at the drawing she had made of 3 people holding hands, at the foundation he had just spent 10 hours repairing. Tomorrow would bring Gary Torres in a compressed timeline and 300 children who deserved a safe place to celebrate. Tomorrow would test every skill he had learned in 12 years of engineering and every promise he had made to a woman who no longer breathed but whose influence shaped every choice he made. David closed his eyes, letting exhaustion pull him under for whatever rest he could claim before dawn. The last thought before sleep was not of failure or fear, but of Michelle's shoulder brushing his arm in the darkness, the unexpected steadiness of another person choosing to stand beside him instead of expecting him to carry the weight alone. The ground was solid now. Tomorrow they would build. Part 1 complete. Word count 4,892 word. Continuation to reach minimum. The alarm on David's phone cut through the darkness at 5:45 a.m., dragging him from sleep that felt more like drowning than rest. He silenced it quickly, checking on Emily in the pale pre-dawn light filtering through the trailer windows. She was still asleep, curled on her side with the purple crayon now tucked under her pillow like a talisman. He stepped outside into the coastal morning, fog thick enough to taste, condensation already forming on every metal surface. The foundation pad he had built last night looked seared in the gray light, a testament to what could be accomplished when failure was not an option. Marcus arrived first, pulling up in his battered pickup truck with 2 other crew members riding in the bed. "You get any sleep, boss?" "Enough." It was a lie, but Marcus did not push. They had worked together long enough to understand that some mornings required coffee and slunts, rather than conversation. The rest of the crew arrived within minutes. 6 men total, each one understanding the stakes without needing detailed explanation. Children in wheelchairs, pediatric mobility equipment, a foundation that could not fail. David distributed tasks with quick efficiency, assigning teams to different zones of the site. The steel frame components for the main pavilion would arrive with Gary's trucks at noon, which meant they had 6 hours to prep the anchor points, run the preliminary electrical conduits, and mark the exact positions where the vertical supports would bolt into the foundation. Emily woke at 6:30, appearing in the trailer doorway with her hair still in messy braids and sleep creases on her cheek. "Morning, Daddy. Can I have breakfast?" David had packed granola bars and juice boxes, the kind of portable meal that worked for construction sites. He sat with her on the trailer steps, watching the fog slowly burn off as she ate and chattered about her dreams. She had dreamed about mommy and superheroes and a big party where everyone was happy. Are we helping make the party today? We are. Is Miss Michelle coming back? She is. Emily nodded, satisfied with this information. She pulled out her crayons and paper, settling into her usual spot in the truck cab where she could draw while staying out of the way of heavy machinery. David had learned to balance single parenthood with demanding work through careful logistics and the kindness of crew members who understood that sometimes a 6-year-old needed to be part of the world her father built. Michelle arrived at 7:15, her car pulling through the gates with the kind of careful precision she brought to everything. She stepped out wearing practical clothes this time, jeans and a fitted blazer, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She carried a leather messenger bag that David suspected contained every piece of documentation related to Gary Torres and his various attempts at contract manipulation. Morning. How's the prep going? On schedule. Your trucks arrive at noon? Gary confirmed 11:45. I have the text thread time-stamped. David almost smiled. Michelle Hayes fought with paperwork the way he fought with soil mechanics and load calculations. Different tools, same fundamental understanding that details mattered. Emily waved from the truck cab and Michelle lifted her hand in an awkward return gesture that suggested she was still learning the protocol for interacting with enthusiastic children. David watched the exchange, noting the way Michelle's expression softened slightly when Emily smiled, the gap-toothed grin somehow managing to penetrate armor that had been carefully constructed over 15 years. The morning accelerated into controlled chaos as vendors began arriving with lighting equipment, sound systems, and the hundreds of small details that transformed empty ground into an event space. David moved through it all with focused intensity, checking measurements, verifying anchor points, testing the integrity of every connection that would bear weight when the structure went vertical. At 10:42, foundation board members rolled through the side gate. David recognized Karen Martinez, the director, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades managing complex organizations. Behind her walked a woman David had not met before, older, late 50s, wearing expensive casual clothes and an expression that suggested she was looking for problems to identify. That's Brenda Scott. Michelle had materialized at David's elbow, her voice low. Board member. She wanted her nephew's company to get this contract. She's been waiting for me to fail since day one. David filed that information away, categorizing Brenda Scott as a potential obstacle rather than an ally. He had learned in San Francisco that sometimes the worst sabotage came from people who should have been on the same team, individuals more invested in being right than in seeing a project succeed. Brenda's gaze landed on Emily, who was visible in the truck cab, purple crayon moving across paper with determined focus. Is that the contractor's daughter on an active construction zone? Brenda's voice carried across the courtyard, pitched to be heard by Karen and the 2 other board members who had accompanied them. That's a liability issue. David felt his jaw tighten, but Michelle stepped forward before he could respond. That's David Robinson's daughter. She's in a designated safe zone, away from all heavy equipment and restricted access areas. I'm supervising her personally. Brenda's eyebrow arched. You're the event director, not a childcare provider. This represents a concerning lack of focus on your primary responsibilities. Michelle's spine straightened, and David recognized the shift from defensive to offensive, the moment when someone stopped apologizing and started fighting. My primary responsibility is ensuring the safety and success of an event designed to support children with disabilities. David's daughter, Emily, has a congenital heart condition that requires monitoring. If I can't demonstrate basic human compassion for one child, why should anyone trust me to organize an event for 300? The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Karen Martinez looked between Brenda and Michelle, calculating something David could not quite read. Then she nodded once. Noted. Let's continue the site inspection. The group moved toward the main pavilion area, Brenda casting one more disapproving glance at Emily before following. David exhaled slowly, releasing tension he had not realized he was holding. "Thank you." Michelle turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "I meant what I said. If I can't show up for one child, I have no business organizing this event." She walked away before he could respond, following the board members toward the foundation pad David had rebuilt in the night. He watched her go, this woman who fought battles with documentation and moral clarity, who wore superhero costumes to test equipment and defended 6-year-olds she barely knew against board members who could end her career. Emily appeared at his side, slipping her small hand into his much larger one. "Daddy, is Miss Michelle in trouble because of me?" "No, baby. Miss Michelle is brave. She did the right thing. Like a superhero? Exactly like a superhero." Emily considered this, then nodded and returned to her drawings. David checked his watch. 11:30. Gary's trucks would arrive in 15 minutes and the real work would begin. Gary Torres arrived at 11:48, 3 minutes late, backing his fleet of equipment trucks onto the compacted granite foundation with a grinding hiss of air brakes that announced his presence like a territorial challenge. The man himself stepped out of the lead vehicle wearing work boots that had never seen actual labor and a company polo shirt stretched tight across a beer gut he wore like a badge of honor. His face soured the moment he registered the perfectly level foundation pad, realizing instantly that his primary leverage had evaporated overnight. "Drop the steel, Gary." Michelle stood at the edge of the staging area, clipboard in hand, her voice cutting through the diesel noise with the precision of a scalpel. She had transformed back into the armored executive, all sharp edges and controlled fury. "You have exactly 2 hours to assemble the primary frame before the lighting crew needs the airspace." Gary's crew began unloading massive steel trusses, but Gary himself walked toward the foundation pad with the swagger of someone who believed volume could substitute for competence. He stopped at the edge, studying the compacted surface with obvious irritation, then turned to address the small crowd of volunteers and board members who had gathered to watch the construction. "This is what happens when a plant guy decides he's a structural engineer." His voice carried across the courtyard, pitched for maximum audience impact. David had been expecting this, the predictable escalation from a man whose entire strategy relied on creating doubt rather than delivering quality. He set down the laser level he had been using to mark anchor points and walked toward Gary with deliberate calm. "Before the first truss came off the truck, I walked this pad with a laser level and marked 3 soft spots with orange paint. We ran one final roller pass this morning. The compaction density now exceeds county code by 15%. David pulled a small tablet from his back pocket, calling up the readings he had logged at dawn. The numbers were there in black and white, time-stamped and geotagged, the kind of documentation that ended arguments. Then I checked the temporary power station and found your crew had planned to overload one feeder with lighting, catering warmers, and the pediatric charging bank. I split the circuits, labeled the runs with electrical tape, and clipped the corrected diagram to the generator cage." He handed the tablet to Karen Martinez, who had moved closer to listen. The foundation director scanned the data, her expression shifting from concern to something approaching respect. Gary's face flushed red, veins standing out on his neck. "I've been building stages for 20 years, kid. I know how to read a load schedule. Then you know that your plan exceeds the feeder rating by 30% the moment the charging station comes online. The fire marshal will shut down this entire event if they see your original configuration." David's voice remained level, stating facts rather than engaging in the performance Gary wanted. He had learned this strategy from Jennifer, who had navigated hostile hospital administrators by refusing to meet emotion with emotion, instead presenting evidence so clean it left no room for dispute. Michelle stepped forward holding a different stack of papers. Please note that David Robinson provided the corrective engineering plan and the documented safety compliance that Gary Torres failed to produce. She spoke to the board members directly, making the failure public and witnessed. Gary's swagger deflated by visible degrees as he realized the audience he had wanted was now the audience watching him lose. The sub-base failed because your crew skipped compaction logs. David set 3 documents on the hood of Gary's truck where everyone could see them. The missed inspection logs that should have been feed with the county. The signed staging agreement with Gary's own signature committing to specific quality standards. The revised invoice with the handwritten surcharge that violated the escrow terms. Here are the missed logs. Here is your signed scope. Here is the unauthorized surcharge. Here is the corrected load schedule the fire marshal will see if you want to keep arguing. Brenda Scott had been watching from near the main house, her arms crossed, clearly waiting for Michelle to stumble. But Karen Martinez was nodding slowly, connecting the dots between Gary's corner cutting and the potential disaster it represented. Mr. Torres, I suggest you focus on completing the work you were contracted to perform. Ms. Hayes and Mr. Robinson appear to have the safety protocols well in hand. Gary sneered but directed his crew to begin unloading the massive steel trusses. David stood by the perimeter checking the tension lines on the mature oak trees they were using as secondary anchor points. He had spent 2 weeks calculating the load distribution across those trees, installing steel cable rated for 5,000 pounds of tension, wrapping each trunk with protective padding to prevent bark damage. The arborist certification sat in his truck, ready to be produced if anyone questioned the methodology. The crew worked fast, maybe too fast. David watched them skip the secondary locking pins on the base plates, relying only on gravity and the primary bolts to hold the massive frame in position. It was the kind of shortcut that seemed fine until coastal wind hit 20 knots and physics demonstrated why code requirements existed. Hold up. David did not raise his voice to a scream. He dropped it to a low carrying bark that cut through the clatter of metal on metal, the tone he used when safety trumped politeness. He stepped onto the platform and pointed at the massive corner stanchion where 4 pieces of steel met in a joint that would bear thousands of pounds of distributed weight. You missed the shear pins on the base flange. If the coastal wind hits 20 knots, that truss will twist and snap the primary bolt. Gary walked over, his face flushed darker now, ego wounded in front of his own crew. Gravity holds it. The pins are redundant. The pins are code. David pulled his torque wrench from his belt, the heavy calibrated tool that Jennifer had given him for his 30th birthday, along with a card that read, "For the man who builds things right the first time." He knelt by the base plate, ignoring Gary completely, and slid the heavy steel pin into the alignment hole. The fit was precise, engineered tolerance measured in thousandths of an inch. He locked the wrench onto the bolt and pulled hard, the sharp click of the calibrated tool echoing across the deck as it hit exactly 50 foot-pounds of torque. David stood up and handed Gary the wrench. 50 pounds of torque on every base plate, Gary, or I call the fire marshal right now and have the site condemned for structural negligence. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 30. Then Gary snatched the wrench and barked at his men to go back and pin the bases properly. David stepped off the deck, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. Michelle met his eyes across the distance, and something passed between them that had no name yet but felt like recognition. 2 people who understood that competence was not about being loud, it was about being right. Emily had been drawing in her designated safe zone, but now she appeared at David's side with a new picture. This one showed stick figures installing something large and complicated, with labels in careful 6-year-old handwriting. Daddy fixing things and Miss Michelle making sure and bad man learning to do better. Can I show Miss Michelle? Sure, baby girl, just stay away from the heavy equipment. Emily skipped across the courtyard, her purple dress bright against the gray granite. David watched her go, his heart doing the complicated thing it always did when his daughter moved through the world with such fearless trust. Michelle knelt down to Emily's level when the girl approached, accepting the drawing with careful attention that suggested she was learning something about how to interact with small humans who saw the world in primary colors and absolute truth. By 3 in the afternoon, the pavilion frame was up, the heavy canvas canopy secured with marine-grade fasteners that would hold against anything short of a hurricane. The lighting crew was running cables through the overhead trusses, their movements choreographed with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. David was checking the perimeter lighting when he heard the sharp crack of metal followed by a shout that turned his blood to ice. On the main stage, a massive lighting truss suspended 15 feet in the air by a chain hoist was hanging at a terrifying angle. Gary's crew had miscalculated the load balance on the rigging motor and the chain was slipping, gears grinding violently as they struggled to hold weight they were never designed to bear. If it fell, it would crush the main podium and tear through the newly installed deck like paper. Gary stood below it, yelling uselessly into a radio, his face pale with the kind of fear that came from understanding consequences too late. Michelle was sprinting across the lawn from the command tent, her face drained of color. David did not think about liability or insurance or any of the careful boundaries that governed professional relationships. He dropped his clipboard and ran. "Clear the deck!" His voice left no room for argument, the command tone he had learned from construction foremen who understood that hesitation killed people. The volunteers scattered. David hit the stairs of the stage at a sprint, bypassing Gary completely, and reached the motor control box at the base of the scaffolding. The electronic override was jammed, the safety mechanism that should have prevented this exact scenario now useless against mechanical failure and human incompetence. The chain gave another agonizing lurch, dropping the truss a full foot closer to catastrophe. David did not have time to fix the electronics or wait for someone else to solve the problem. He pulled the heavy carabiner and the length of high-tensile climbing rope he kept on his harness for tree work. Equipment that had seemed like overkill when he packed it this morning but now represented the difference between tragedy and survival. He scaled the side of the scaffolding, his boots finding the aluminum rungs purely by muscle memory, hands moving with the kind of automated precision that came from 12 years of working at heights. The heat of the halogen lights burned the back of his neck as he reached the crossbar, sweat already stinging his eyes despite the coastal breeze. "Brace it!" He threw the rope over the primary steel I-beam of the tent structure, creating a makeshift pulley system, and clipped the carabiner directly to the slipping truss, bypassing the broken motor entirely. The truss dropped another 2 inches and David wrapped the slack of the rope around the structural upright using friction to catch the weight. The rope snapped taut, biting deep into his leather gloves, the sheer physical shock of 2,000 pounds transferring through the line and into his shoulders and spine. Pain lanced through his palms where the friction generated heat that burned through the seam of his right glove. But the truss was locked. It was not falling. David held the tension, breathing hard, muscles trembling with the sustained effort of keeping physics at bay through nothing but rope and will. Below him, Gary's crew finally rushed in with secondary chains to secure the load properly, their movements frantic with the kind of urgency that should have been present from the beginning. Once they had it locked, David slowly released the tension on the rope, his arms shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump that followed crisis. He climbed down the scaffolding carefully, testing each rung before committing his weight, the way Jennifer had made him promise to do after a near miss on a job site 7 years ago. His boots hit the wooden deck with a heavy thud. The stage was silent. Gary would not meet his eyes, shame and fear warring on his face. Michelle was standing 5 feet away, her hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide with something that looked like terror poorly disguised as relief. "You're bleeding." Her voice was very quiet. David looked down at his hands. The friction of the rope had burned through the seam of his right glove, leaving a raw red line across his palm. Not deep, just a surface burn that would heal in a week, but the skin was angry and weeping clear fluid. "I'm fine. The load is secure." Michelle lowered her hands and David saw them trembling. "Gary Torres, you're off this site." Her voice was cold iron, the kind of pronouncement that ended arguments before they started. "Your crew is done. Leave the equipment. The Foundation's lawyers will contact you on Monday regarding your breach of safety protocols and the near-catastrophic failure that almost killed someone today." For once, Gary did not argue. He signaled his men and they packed up their personal tools and left, the trucks pulling out of the estate with the defeated silence of people who understood they had pushed their luck too far and lost. Michelle walked toward David, her professional composure cracking at the edges. "You could have died, but I didn't. And neither did anyone else." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he might comment on the weather or the load capacity of a beam. Michelle's face did something complicated, anger and gratitude and fear mixing into an expression he could not quite parse. Emily had been in her safe zone when it happened, protected by the distance David always maintained between his daughter and active work areas. But now she was running toward him, her purple dress flying, face streaked with tears. "Daddy!" David knelt despite the protest from his burned palm, catching her as she crashed into him. "I'm okay, baby, I'm okay. You climbed so high. I was scared, I know, but I had to make sure everyone stayed safe, like a superhero. Like a dad who knows how to use a rope properly." Emily pulled back, studying his face with the intensity only children could bring to reading emotion. Miss Michelle was scared too. She was crying. David glanced up at Michelle, who had turned away, her shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining control. He stood, keeping one hand on Emily's shoulder. "Sometimes brave people get scared. That's what makes them brave." The walkthrough was scheduled for 5 p.m., which gave them less than 90 minutes to complete all the finishing work that should have taken 6 hours. David's crew worked with grim efficiency, installing the wheelchair charging stations David had rewired the night before, setting up the emergency medical tent, running the final safety checks on every anchor point and electrical connection. Michelle coordinated with a clipboard and a phone, her voice steady again as she directed volunteers and verified deliveries. The Foundation director, Karen Martinez, arrived in a black town car at 4:58, 2 minutes early. She stepped out wearing sensible shoes and an expression of professional skepticism, walking the site with a critical eye that missed nothing. The pavilion stood solid against the coastal sky. The lighting was perfect, creating pools of warm illumination that would make the evening event feel intimate despite the scale. The interactive zones were safe and vibrant, the wheelchair routes wide and smooth with precisely calculated slopes that met ADA requirements without feeling institutional. Karen stopped near the main stage, turning in a slow circle to take in the full scope of what had been accomplished in less than 24 hours. "It's a miracle you pulled this off a day early, Michelle. The staging is flawless." Michelle did not accept the praise and move on. She turned, scanning the perimeter until she found David standing by his truck with Emily. She pointed directly at him, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet lawn. "I didn't pull it off alone. David Robinson engineered the foundation overnight when the contractor failed, and he secured the overhead rigging this afternoon when it nearly collapsed. He saved this event. His firm is the only reason we're standing here." The public credit, given without hesitation and in front of witnesses who mattered, hit David harder than the physical labor of the last 2 days. Michelle had not hidden him or claimed the victory for her own resume. She had made sure he was seen, that his competence was recognized by people who controlled contracts and budgets and future opportunities. Karen walked toward David, extending her hand. "Mr. Robinson, thank you. The Foundation would like to discuss retaining your services for our future projects." David shook her hand, aware of Emily watching this interaction with wide eyes. "I'd be happy to discuss that, ma'am." Brenda Scott stood near the pavilion entrance, her face tight with an expression that suggested she had been hoping for failure and now had to recalibrate her entire strategy. Karen noticed her board member's reaction and turned to address her directly. "Brenda, I believe you had concerns about Ms. Hayes's management approach." Brenda's jaw worked for a moment before she managed to speak. "I may have been premature in my assessment. It was not quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And in the world of nonprofit boards and professional politics, acknowledgement was sometimes the best you could hope for." The gala began at 7 p.m., the estate transforming into something magical as dusk settled over the Pacific. String lights came alive across the olive trees David had rehabilitated, creating canopies of warm light that felt like stars brought down to earth. Music drifted from the main stage, a live band playing covers of songs from 3 decades chosen to appeal to the widest possible audience. Children arrived in wheelchairs and braces and with the kind of determined joy that came from communities that understood celebration was not guaranteed but chosen. Their parents moved among them with careful attention, ready to intervene if medical needs arose, but mostly just watching their kids be kids in a space designed specifically to accommodate their bodies and their needs. Michelle was back in the Spider-Man suit, surrounded by a dozen children who wanted photos and autographs and the chance to tell this strange superhero adult about their favorite characters. She had learned something in the hours since Emily first approached her, some shift in body language that made her more accessible, less defended. She knelt for photos and listened to rambling stories and looked genuinely happy in a way David suspected she had not allowed herself to feel in years. David stayed near the perimeter, monitoring the generator loads and checking the ground stability every 30 minutes. It was his job to watch the structural integrity, but his eyes kept tracking Michelle, noting the way she moved through the crowd with increasing confidence, the way the children responded to her presence without fear or hesitation. Emily had found a group of kids her age near the interactive zone, showing them her drawings and explaining in serious tones about how her daddy fixed things and Miss Michelle made sure everything was safe. One little boy in a wheelchair asked if Emily's dad was a superhero too, and Emily's response carried across the lawn with perfect clarity. "He's better than a superhero. He's my daddy." David felt something crack open in his chest, the kind of emotion that had no safe outlet but demanded acknowledgement anyway. Jennifer would have loved this. She would have been here in scrubs straight from a shift, kneeling beside kids with medical equipment, making them laugh while she checked their oxygen levels and heart rates. She would have seen Michelle's transformation and nudged David with her elbow, whispering that he should ask the pretty CEO to dance. But Jennifer was 3 years in the ground, and David was still learning how to live in a world where her absence was permanent. He checked the generator loads again, finding comfort in numbers and mechanical systems that behaved according to predictable laws. At 8:15, one of the pediatric equipment representatives hurried over from the mobility zone, his face tight with stress. "We have a problem. The East charging bank is tripping every time 2 chairs plug in simultaneously." David followed him across the lawn, opening the weatherproof electrical panel with movements made automatic by repetition. Gary's crew had ignored the load split David had taped to the panel, tying the charger bank into the decorative lighting circuit instead of the dedicated feeder David had staged specifically for this purpose. It was exactly the kind of lazy incompetence David had anticipated and planned for. He shut down the branch breaker, rerouted the charger bank to the dedicated feeder, and replaced one undersized connector with the spare cam lock he had brought from his truck. 4 minutes later, the charging hub hummed steadily, and the perimeter lights did not even flicker. "You just saved us from shutting down the entire section." The representative looked genuinely relieved. David closed the panel and secured it, wiping his hands on the shop rag that lived in his back pocket. Michelle was there when he stood, having materialized from the crowd, with the kind of silent approach that suggested she had been watching. "You planned for this, too." Her voice held something between admiration and exhaustion. "I planned for Gary not following directions." For one brief second, in the middle of the lights and music and donor chatter, she looked at him the way people look at walls that have already held through storms. Safe, reliable, present. Emily appeared at David's side, tugging on his sleeve. "Daddy, can I go play on the obstacle course? Stay where I can see you, and if you feel tired, you come right back." "I will, I promise." She skipped off toward the supervised play area, her energy inexhaustible despite the long day. Michelle watched her go, something soft crossing her face. "She's wonderful. She's my whole world." The words came out more raw than David intended, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained. Michelle turned to look at him, and in the warm glow of the string lights, he could see the exhaustion beneath her competence, the weight she had been carrying for months finally easing into something manageable. Around 10 p.m., the event started winding down. Families began their careful departures, loading wheelchairs and equipment, exchanging contact information and promises to stay in touch. The band played softer songs now, background music for cleanup crews who moved through the space with quiet efficiency. David was packing tools into his truck bed when he heard footsteps on gravel. Michelle approached, wearing a heavy wool coat over the costume, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual severe style. "You're leaving? My job is done. The site is secure. I heard Gary mention you had a contract in San Diego starting Monday." David frowned, irritation flashing through him at Gary's loose tongue and presumptuous gossip. "Gary talks too much. I turned down San Diego yesterday." Michelle stopped, her expression shifting from exhausted to alert. "Why?" He looked at her standing in the driveway, still wearing the bright, improbable suit under her coat, still carrying herself like someone who had fought a war and won. He thought about the distance he had kept, the professional boundaries that had governed every interaction for 2 weeks. The sheer discipline it had taken not to touch her when she broke down about failing the children, not to pull her close when she watched him climb scaffolding to catch a falling truss. "Because I'm tired of building temporary things." His voice was quiet, stripped of professional filter. "I build pavilions that get torn down in 3 days. I plant gardens for people who never walk in them. I want to build something that lasts." He took a step forward, breaking the safe proximity rule he had enforced since the first day they met. The height difference forced her to tilt her head up, and in the amber light of the perimeter lamps he could see her pulse beating fast in the hollow of her throat. Michelle did not step back. She held her ground, looking up at him with eyes that reflected exhaustion and hope and something unnamed that felt like possibility. "David, we've known each other 2 weeks. I know that you showed up when it mattered. I know that you stood up to Gary and Brenda and your own board when they tried to intimidate you. I know that you learned how to talk to my daughter even though kids terrify you. I know that you're brave enough to keep trying when everything is falling apart." He paused, the words coming from somewhere deeper than strategy or calculation. "I know that for the first time in 3 years I'm thinking about building a future instead of just surviving the present." Michelle's breath caught, visible in the cool coastal air. She reached out slowly, her fingers gentle as they touched the raw rope burn on his palm. It was not a lingering, exploring touch. It was grounding, an acknowledgement of cost and consequence. "I'm scared." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Say it again." David's response was immediate, the demand soft but absolute. "What? Say you're scared. Out loud. No armor." Michelle's eyes widened slightly, but she did not retreat. "I'm terrified. I'm terrified I'll fail. I'm terrified I'll lose you like I lost Rachel. I'm terrified that for the first time in 15 years I care more about being with you than being successful. Then let's be terrified together." David reached up, his hand hovering for a second before he gently cupped the side of her face. His thumb rested against her jaw and he held there for one measured second. It was not a frantic grab, it was arrival at a destination after a long, exhausting drive. He leaned down and kissed her, soft and deliberate, sealing a promise without a single word spoken. The chaos of the last 2 weeks, the noise, the deadlines, the failing steel suddenly went completely silent. It felt like dropping an anchor in deep water. It felt like permanence. When he pulled back, Michelle kept her hand over his, her eyes closed for a brief second of pure relief. "We need to strike the tents by Sunday." David's voice was soft, the practical reality returning but the weight of it gone. "I'll handle the logistics, you just handle the ground." Michelle opened her eyes and a genuine, relaxed smile finally broke across her face, the first David had seen that reached all the way to the sadness Emily had identified on that first strange afternoon. Emily appeared from the darkness, her purple dress grass-stained and her braids coming loose. "Daddy, are you kissing the superhero?" David laughed, the sound surprising him with its ease. "Yeah, baby, I am. Does that mean she's staying?" He looked at Michelle, who was watching Emily with an expression that suggested she was still learning how to navigate this particular terrain. "I think that means we're all staying." Friday morning arrived with fog so thick it turned the estate into something ethereal, the kind of coastal weather that made solid structures appear to float. David had slept 3 hours in the construction trailer. Emily curled beside him on the narrow cot, her breathing steady and peaceful despite the compressed timeline that had consumed the previous day. He woke at 5:30 to find Michelle's car already parked near the command tent, the woman herself visible through the trailer window as she worked under the glow of a battery-powered lantern. The gala had been perfect. The cleanup would be brutal. David extracted himself carefully from the cot, covering Emily with the blanket she had kicked off during the night. He stepped outside into the pre-dawn cold, his breath visible in the air, and walked toward the command tent where Michelle sat surrounded by invoices and final documentation. "You never went home." She looked up, dark circles under her eyes but her spine still straight. "Karen called at 11. Donald Anderson is arriving at 6 a.m. He wants an early inspection before the official walkthrough." David felt his stomach drop. Donald Anderson was the billionaire donor whose schedule change had compressed their timeline from the beginning. The man was notorious for showing up unannounced at projects he funded, asking technical questions that exposed incompetence, and withdrawing support from organizations that failed to meet his exacting standards. What does he want to see? Everything. The foundation, the electrical systems, the ADA compliance. He mentioned specifically wanting to verify the wheelchair charging stations. David nodded slowly, running through mental calculations. The charging stations were solid. He had rewired them himself, splitting the loads properly, installing ground fault protection that exceeded code requirements. But Anderson would test them, would ask about circuit capacity and backup power and every detail that separated professional work from adequate work. "I'll walk the site again, check every connection." "David, you've been up for 2 days straight, so have you." Michelle's expression softened slightly, acknowledgement passing between them of the cost they had both paid to reach this point. "I made coffee. It's terrible, but it's hot." She poured him a cup from a thermos that had seen better days. The coffee was indeed terrible, bitter and overbrewed, but the caffeine hit his system like a starter motor turning over an engine. David drank half the cup, then set it down and headed toward the charging station with his testing equipment. The next hour passed in methodical verification, voltage readings, ground continuity, GFCI response time, weatherproofing integrity. David documented everything with photos and meter readings, building the kind of evidence trail that would survive Anderson's scrutiny. The charging station was not just code compliant, it was overbuilt, designed with redundancy that anticipated failure modes and addressed them before they could manifest. Emily woke at 6:15, appearing from the trailer in her purple pajamas with her hair wild around her face. "Daddy, I'm hungry." David had packed granola bars, but nothing substantial. Michelle appeared from the command tent carrying a paper bag. I stopped at the bakery on my way back from dropping off the final vendor payments. "Cinnamon rolls." She offered the bag to Emily, who accepted it with wide eyes and immediate enthusiasm. David watched the interaction, noting the way Michelle had learned to meet Emily at eye level, to speak directly rather than through David as an intermediary. Small shifts, but meaningful. "Emily, can you eat in the trailer? We have an important visitor coming soon." "Okay, Daddy, can I draw while I eat?" "Of course, baby girl." Emily skipped back to the trailer, cinnamon roll clutched in both hands. Michelle stood, brushing crumbs from her jeans. "Thank you for thinking of her. I spent 15 years avoiding anything that reminded me of Rachel. But Emily doesn't remind me of loss. She reminds me of what my sister loved about being alive." The honesty in that statement felt like a gift. David wanted to respond, to acknowledge the vulnerability, but headlights cut through the fog as a black town car pulled through the estate gates. Donald Anderson had arrived 20 minutes early. The man who stepped out of the vehicle looked younger than his 68 years, still possessing the kind of lean energy that came from people who treated their bodies like high-performance machines requiring maintenance and optimization. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt, clothing that cost more than David's truck payment but was designed to appear casual. His eyes swept the sight with the assessing gaze of someone who had built a fortune by identifying problems before they became crises. "Ms. Hayes, Mr. Robinson." Anderson's voice was neutral, offering neither warmth nor hostility. Karen Martinez emerged from the second car, looking stressed despite the early hour. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for coming. As you can see, the site exceeded all our expectations. I'll determine that myself." Anderson walked toward the main pavilion, his stride purposeful. David fell into step beside him, matching pace but maintaining respectful distance. Michelle flanked Anderson's other side, her clipboard held like a shield. The foundation work was completed overnight 2 days ago. County inspection passed with notation that compaction density exceeded requirements. Anderson stopped, kneeling to examine the granite surface. He pulled a pocket knife from his khakis and scratched at the compacted stone, testing hardness. "Who performed the work?" "I did." David kept his answer simple, factual. "You're the landscape architect and a licensed professional engineer with structural certification. The original contractor failed to meet compaction standards. I corrected the deficiency." Anderson stood, studying David with increased interest. "Show me the charging stations." They walked across the lawn where children had played the night before, the grass still showing faint impressions from wheelchair treads. The charging station sat under a weatherproof canopy, 6 outlets arranged around a central hub, each protected by its own circuit breaker and ground fault interrupter. Anderson stopped at the control panel, opening it to examine the wiring. "What's your circuit capacity?" 30 amps per outlet, dedicated feeder from the main panel. Total capacity 180 amps with 20% overhead for surge protection. And if the main power fails, automatic transfer switch connects to the backup generator within 3 seconds. Generator runs a self-test cycle every Monday. Anderson traced the wire runs with his finger, checking for proper strain relief and cable management. He found David's labeling, each wire marked with origin, destination, and amperage rating in waterproof ink. "This is professional grade work. It's the only kind worth doing when children's safety depends on it." Anderson closed the panel and turned to face David directly. Ms. Hayes, did you know about Mr. Robinson's qualifications when you hired him? I knew he was overqualified for landscape architecture. I didn't realize how overqualified until Gary Torres tried to sabotage the project. Anderson's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something that might have been approval. I received a call Wednesday evening from Brenda Scott. She suggested I withhold my donation because this project was being mismanaged. Michelle's face went carefully blank, but David saw her hands tighten on the clipboard. I came early not to catch you failing. I came to see if Brenda's concerns had merit. Anderson paused, letting the tension build. They don't. This is the most meticulously planned charity event I've attended in 30 years of philanthropy. You're getting the full $500,000 and I'm adding $200,000 for next year's budget. Karen Martinez let out a breath she had been holding. Michelle's expression cracked slightly, relief bleeding through professional composure. Mr. Anderson, I don't know what to say. Say you'll maintain these standards. Say you'll continue working with competent people who understand that excellence isn't negotiable. Anderson turned to David. Your wife would be proud of what you built here. David felt the words land in his chest like a physical impact. He had not mentioned Jennifer to Anderson, which meant the man had researched him, had learned about the widowed engineer raising a daughter while building projects that prioritize safety over profit. She taught me that quality matters more than speed. Anderson nodded once, then returned to his car. Karen Martinez followed, pausing only to squeeze Michelle's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and relief. The sun was burning through the fog now, revealing the full scope of what they had accomplished. The pavilion stood solid against the coastal morning. The interactive zones were clean and ready for strike down. The wheelchair routes showed no signs of settling or failure. Emily emerged from the trailer, her cinnamon roll finished and her face sticky with frosting. She ran to David, wrapping her arms around his leg. Did we pass the test, Daddy? We did, baby girl. Michelle knelt down to Emily's level, and David watched his daughter study the woman who had transformed from stranger to presence in their lives over the course of 2 intense weeks. Miss Michelle, are you going to help Daddy with the next project? Michelle glanced up at David, something uncertain flickering in her eyes. I hope so. If your daddy wants the help, he does. David's answer was immediate and absolute. Emily nodded, satisfied with this arrangement, and skipped off to examine a butterfly that had landed on one of the olive trees. The foundation board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning at 9. David had not planned to attend, but Karen Martinez called Sunday evening with a request that he be present. Michelle picked him up at 8:30, driving them to the foundation's administrative building in downtown Santa Barbara. Emily was at school, giving David rare freedom to navigate professional obligations without coordinating childcare logistics. The boardroom was exactly what David expected. Long polished table, leather chairs, walls lined with photographs of past charity events and grateful families. Brenda Scott sat at the far end, her expression neutral but her posture defensive. Karen Martinez occupied the head of the table, flanked by 4 other board members David recognized from the gala. Thank you all for coming. This is a brief meeting to address concerns raised by board member Brenda Scott regarding the management of Friday's gala. Brenda leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. I move to formally censure Michelle Hayes for unprofessional conduct during the planning and execution of the event. Karen's expression did not change. On what grounds? Romantic involvement with a contractor during an active project. Allowing said contractor's child on an active construction site. Prioritizing personal relationships over professional obligations. The words were delivered with clinical precision, each accusation designed to sound reasonable and measured. Michelle sat very still, her face carefully blank in the way David recognized as armor against attack. I'd like to address this. Donald Anderson's voice cut through the tension. He had been sitting quietly near the window, and David had not realized the billionaire was attending what should have been routine internal business. "Mr. Anderson, with respect, this is a board matter." Brenda's tone suggested she very much did not want Anderson's input. "With respect, Ms. Scott, I'm the largest donor to this organization. My opinion carries weight whether you welcome it or not." Anderson stood walking to the window that overlooked the Santa Barbara harbor. "I watched Michelle Hayes work 18-hour days for a week. I watched her prioritize a child's safety over her career advancement. I watched her turn what should have been a catastrophic failure into the best executed event I've attended. If this board censures her, I withdraw all funding, permanently." The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda's face flushed red, but she held her tongue. Karen Martinez looked at Anderson, then at Michelle, then at the other board members. "The motion is denied. Furthermore, I'm offering Michelle the permanent position of Director of Events, effective immediately." Michelle stood, her voice steady. "I accept, on one condition." Karen raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "David Robinson becomes our exclusive structural consultant for all future projects." Non-negotiable. David had not expected this, the public claim of partnership and competence declared before witnesses who controlled budgets and contracts. "Mr. Robinson, do you accept these terms?" He had spent 3 years taking freelance contracts that kept him mobile and uncommitted, always ready to disappear if grief became overwhelming or if Emily's medical needs required flexibility. Permanent arrangement meant stability. It meant showing up consistently. It meant building something that lasted. "I don't need charity contracts. It's not charity. It's hiring the best. That's you." Michelle's voice was firm, meeting his eyes across the boardroom with absolute certainty. "Then I accept." Brenda Scott gathered her papers, her face tight with controlled fury. "I believe this board has lost sight of professional standards. I'm resigning my position effective today." She stood and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Karen waited until the door closed before speaking again. "Well, that simplifies several ongoing conflicts of interest." The other board members chuckled, tension breaking like a storm front moving past. David stayed for another 20 minutes discussing scope and timeline for upcoming projects. But his attention kept drifting to Michelle. She had fought for him publicly, had made his competence a condition of her own acceptance. It was the opposite of every professional relationship he had navigated, where credit was hoarded and partnerships were transactional. They left the building together, stepping into brilliant California sunshine that made the previous week's fog feel like distant memory. 18 months later, David stood in the kitchen of the house he and Michelle had bought together, watching spring morning light pour through windows that faced the Pacific. The house was modest but solid, built in the 1960s with good bones and updating that prioritized function over flash. Emily sat at the kitchen table, now 8 years old, her gap-toothed smile replaced by permanent teeth, but her love of purple undiminished. She was teaching Joshua how to draw superheroes. Joshua was 5, Michelle's legally adopted son as of 6 months ago. Cerebral palsy affected his legs but not his spirit, and he navigated the world from a custom wheelchair with the kind of determined joy that reminded David of the children who had attended that first gala. Michelle had seen Joshua at a foster care event 3 months after she and David started dating, and the decision to adopt had been immediate and absolute. "Can I draw your mom?" Joshua's question was directed at Emily, who considered it seriously. "Which one? I have 2 now." Joshua's eyes went wide. "You can have 2?" Emily nodded, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "Mommy Jennifer is in heaven. She taught Daddy how to love people. Mama Michelle is here. She teaches me how to be brave." David felt his throat tighten, the casual way Emily had integrated Michelle into her understanding of family, somehow more profound than any formal ceremony could achieve. Michelle appeared in the doorway wearing running clothes, her hair pulled back, face flushed from her morning jog along the coastal trail. Who's teaching what now? Emily teaching Joshua about family structures. Michelle walked to the table, kneeling between the two children to examine their drawings. Joshua had sketched something that might have been a person or might have been an abstract representation of motion, but Emily was treating it with serious artistic consideration. That's really good, Joshua. I like how you used the red for the cape. It's like Miss Michelle's superhero suit, the one from the pictures. The photographs from that first gala hung in the hallway, a reminder of where this improbable family had its origins. Michelle in the Spider-Man costume, surrounded by laughing children. David on scaffolding, rope wrapped around steel. Emily presenting her drawing to Karen Martinez, explaining in careful detail how her daddy fixed things. David started making pancakes using the recipe Jennifer had perfected over years of weekend breakfasts. Michelle joined him at the stove, their movements synchronized through 18 months of shared mornings. Karen called. She wants to know if you can look at the new community center foundation. The county inspector flagged some concerns. When does she need me? Site visit tomorrow if you're available. I'm available. Michelle bumped his shoulder with hers, a gesture of affection and partnership. You always are. It was true. David had stopped running from commitment, had stopped treating every project as temporary and every relationship as provisional. The work was steady, challenging, meaningful. The foundation had expanded its mission under Michelle's leadership, building not just event spaces but permanent facilities designed to serve communities long-term. Emily and Joshua had finished their drawings, presenting them for parental approval. Emily's showed the family of 4 on a beach building something elaborate in the sand. Joshua's showed a wheelchair with wings. Can we go to the beach today? Emily's question was directed at both adults equally. After breakfast, if everyone eats without complaint, even the vegetables? Especially the vegetables. Joshua wrinkled his nose but nodded acceptance. David served pancakes, the familiar ritual grounding him in present reality rather than past grief. They ate together, the conversation flowing between school and friends and the hermit crab Joshua wanted to find at the beach. After breakfast, they packed the car with beach equipment modified for Joshua's wheelchair. Wide wheels that could handle sand, a canopy for shade, towels and sunscreen, and the portable oxygen monitor Emily still wore even though her heart condition had remained stable for years. The beach was less crowded on Monday mornings, mostly locals and retirees who understood the rhythm of coastal weather. David helped Joshua from the car into his chair, and Michelle grabbed the buckets and shovels. Emily ran ahead, her purple swimsuit bright against the sand. They found a spot near the waterline where the sand was firm enough for Joshua's wheels. David and Michelle worked together to build an elaborate sea castle, the kind of temporary structure that would last only until the tide came in. Emily directed the construction with serious focus, explaining to Joshua about load-bearing walls and proper moisture content for structural integrity. She's been listening to your work calls. Michelle's observation was delivered with amusement, better engineering talk than whatever she'd pick up from other sources. Joshua wanted to know if the castle would fall down, his face worried. Probably. But we'll build it again tomorrow. That's what families do. David knelt beside Joshua's wheelchair, helping the boy pack sand into a bucket for the castle's tower. Uncle David, are you still a superhero? Emily had been teaching Joshua to call them Uncle David and Aunt Michelle, though the legal paperwork for David to formally adopt Joshua was still processing through family court. No, buddy. I'm just a man who learned that asking for help is braver than doing it alone. But you saved people. Emily showed me the pictures. I fixed things that were broken. That's different than being a superhero. Michelle sat back on her heels, watching the conversation with an expression David had learned to read as contentment mixed with wonder at the life they had built from crisis and coastal fog and mutual exhaustion. Emily appeared with a collection of shells, arranging them around the castle's perimeter as decoration. "Mama Michelle, is this like when you wore the spider suit?" "Very similar. Sometimes you wear costumes to show kids it's okay to play." "Were you scared when Daddy climbed the tall thing?" Emily's question was matter of fact, but Michelle's expression shifted to something more serious. "Very scared. But being scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you care about what happens next." David watched his daughter absorb this wisdom, filing it away with all the other lessons she collected from the adults who loved her. The castle was taking shape now, a structure that would last maybe 6 hours before the Pacific claimed it, temporary but built with care. They stayed at the beach until early afternoon, Joshua's energy finally depleting as the sun climbed higher. David carried the boy back to the car, Michelle and Emily following with the equipment. The drive home was quiet, both children dozing in the back seat. "Do you ever regret it?" Michelle's question was soft, her eyes on the coastal highway ahead. Turning down San Diego, moving in together, adopting Joshua, any of it. "Every morning I wake up next to you, I know I made the right choice." "Say it again." Michelle's request carried the echo of that night in the estate driveway, when David had demanded she voice her fear without armor. "I love you, Michelle Hayes Robinson." The hyphenated name had been her choice, keeping Hayes professionally while taking Robinson personally. David had not cared about the mechanics, only about the commitment. "I love you, David Robinson." They pulled into the driveway of their house, the modest structure that had become home through 18 months of shared meals and midnight feedings when Joshua had nightmares and early morning site inspections when foundation work called. Emily woke first, stretching in the back seat. "Can we build another castle tomorrow, if the weather holds?" Michelle carried Joshua inside, settling him on the couch with cartoons playing softly. David started preparing dinner, the rhythm of domestic life no longer feeling like survival but like living. Emily appeared at his side holding a new drawing. "This is us, all of us." The picture showed 4 figures on a beach, hands joined with a 5th figure sketched faintly in purple in the background. David recognized Jennifer's presence, the way Emily kept her mother woven into their family narrative without grief or resentment. "Who's that in purple, baby girl?" "Mommy Jennifer. She's always with us. She taught you how to love us." Emily's understanding of complex emotional architecture continued to surprise him. She had integrated Michelle not as replacement but as addition, had made room for Joshua not through obligation but through genuine affection. That's right, she did. Michelle appeared in the kitchen doorway, watching the exchange with the kind of careful attention she brought to moments that mattered. "Should I add her to the family photos?" Emily's question was directed at both adults. "That's up to you, sweetheart, but I think your mom would like being included. Then I'll put her in all of them, so she knows we didn't forget." David pulled Emily close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. She smelled like sunscreen and salt water and the particular sweetness of childhood that disappeared too quickly. Dinner was simple, pasta and vegetables, the kind of meal that accommodated both children's preferences while maintaining nutritional standards Michelle had researched extensively. They ate together at the table, conversation flowing between Joshua's retelling of a cartoon plot and Emily's explanation of a science project due Friday. After dinner, David helped Joshua with his physical therapy exercises while Michelle supervised Emily's homework. The routines were established now, carved from 18 months of trial and error and mutual adjustment. 2 people who had built careers on solitary competence, learning to share space and decision-making and the mundane machinery of raising children. Bedtime came with stories and tucking in, and the checking of monitors. Emily's oxygen levels remained steady, Joshua's muscle tension had decreased after therapy. The house settled into nighttime quiet, just the sound of the Pacific in the distance and the occasional creak of settling wood. David found Michelle on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching stars appear as the last light bled from the western sky. Karen approved the community center budget. Construction starts in 6 weeks. He sat beside her, pulling part of the blanket over his own shoulders. That's good, steady work, more than that. It's building something permanent. Like us? Exactly like us. Michelle leaned against his shoulder, the gesture familiar and grounding. I spent 15 years running from anything that reminded me of Rachel. From connection, from risk, from the possibility of loss. Then a 6-year-old girl told me I had sad eyes and everything changed. Emily has that effect. It wasn't just Emily. It was you. Showing up when Gary tried to sabotage everything. Climbing scaffolding to catch falling steel, refusing to compromise on safety even when it cost you. I was just doing my job. You were demonstrating integrity. That's different than compliance. David pulled her closer, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing sync with his own. Jennifer told me before she died that I needed to build things that lasted. I thought she meant structures, foundations and retaining walls and drainage systems that would outlive me. And now I know she meant this. Family, partnership, the kind of foundation that holds people up instead of holding dirt back. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars multiply across the darkening sky. Somewhere inside, Emily and Joshua slept peacefully, their dreams protected by adults who had learned that strength was not about never needing help, but about trusting the right people to stand beside you when the ground shifted. The strongest foundation isn't concrete. It's the people who choose to stand with you when everything else is falling apart. David's voice was quiet, the observation offered to the night air and the woman beside him and the family they had built from crisis and exhaustion, and the courage to believe that second chances were not just possible but earned through showing up every single day. Michelle turned her face up to his, starlight catching in her eyes. Say it again. He kissed her, soft and certain, the kind of kiss that did not promise perfection but committed to presence. I love you. I love our family. I love the life we're building together. Then let's keep building. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, where the house held warmth and the sleeping children and the accumulated evidence of 18 months spent transforming temporary connection into permanent foundation. Tomorrow would bring site inspections and physical therapy and homework and all the small machinery of ordinary life. But tonight, David Robinson stood in the home he shared with Michelle Hayes Robinson and their 2 children, and understood finally what Jennifer had been trying to tell him in that hospital room 3 years ago. Living was not about surviving loss. It was about building something worth keeping. One careful decision at a time, with people brave enough to trust that foundations could be repaired and futures could be different than pasts, and love did not require perfection, only presence. The ground was solid now. Everything else was just engineering.